So in this video, I want to pick up on some of that material we started looking at a few episodes ago when we used gender as an example to flesh out those concepts of stereotypes, prejudice and discrimination, and when we looked at how psychology represented women. This week, we're digging a bit deeper into that topic of gender, but also the topic of sexuality, because gender and sexuality intersect in interesting ways. Let's start with sex and gender. So, gender is not a biological concept, and sex is not wholly a biological concept, but in many people's minds, they are biological, and this has resulted in what's called a bit of a culture war, where one group rejects the idea that sex and gender are in any way social cultural things, and they say women are women and men are men, and that's a biological fact, and that's the end of the matter. The other group, quite rightly, argue that sex is impacted by gender, and gender is a social cultural thing. And they add that sex is not purely biological, and they reject the idea that there is some sort of inalienable, immutable biological difference between men and women. That means you're born either one or the other. More and more of us are pushing back on that hard binary male-female thing, because some of us, actually a fair few of us, don't conform to that binary classification, hence people identifying their sex as non-binary and the increasingly common practice of people telling others what their preferred pronoun is. And that's not just whether to call the person he or she, but also to specify other pronouns instead. And we need those other pronouns in English because English doesn't have a gender-neutral or third gender singular personal pronoun. So we have to appropriate the use of the collective pronoun, they, as a singular pronoun, personal pronoun, and also to create new pronouns like ze and they, used by some gender, queer and transgender communities. Now, how about sexuality? Well, this is an interesting one because the opposite has happened. There's been a fight to establish sexuality as a biological category. Here, the category was seen as non-biological. It was viewed as learned behaviour that could be unlearned, most horrifically through conversion programs, where people were converted from being gay to straight, or that was the attempt. And up until recently, those conversion programs was a service offered by psychologists. But it's now strongly opposed by many of psychology's professional bodies, such as the APS, APA, and BPS, as well as becoming unlawful in some jurisdictions. So this has been a successful pushback, perhaps as a result of the move to have sexuality seen as a biologically determined thing, for it to be recognised as a biological category. So you're born gay, you don't learn to be gay, you can't train someone not to be gay. And this picks up on that activity we did in our tutorial during Teaching Week 6. The pushback here is against groups who say that being anything other than heterosexual is a choice, but not just a choice, a bad choice. So now we've got a bit of a confused space, as we've got both the social and medical models at work in those social movements related to sex, gender and sexuality, where the medical model is not always on the opposite side of the social movement, as it is with the disability and mental illness movements, for example, that where they push back on the medical model and push for the social model. The social model doesn't work so well in this space. Also in this space, gender and sexuality have acquired many, many different terms that confuse people and makes the whole issue and space obscure and even more confused. So let's spend some time and nail down some of those definitions right now, because it's important to get them right. Sexual orientation. This is an inherent or immutable, enduring, emotional, romantic or sexual attraction to other people. Notice how the word immutable is there. See where that gets tied to something we would associate with a genetic component. and how that aligns with that sort of medical model approach. Gender identity. This is one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both or neither, and how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. Your gender identity can be the same or different from the sex that you were assigned. Gender expression. This is the external appearance of one's gender identity. It's usually expressed through behavior like clothing, how you get your hair cut, your voice, and such things. It may or may not conform to socially defined behaviors and characteristics that are typically associated with being either male or female. Transgender. This is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex that they were assigned at birth. Being transgender doesn't imply any specific sexual orientation. Therefore, transgender people may be straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, or whatever. Gender transition. This is the process by which some people strive more closely align their internal knowledge of their gender with its outward appearance. Some people socially transition, whereby they might begin dressing, begin using names and pronouns, or be generally socially recognized as another gender. Others undergo physical transitions in which they modify their bodies through medical interventions. And gender dysphoria. This is seen as the clinically significant distress caused when a person's assigned birth gender is not the same as the one which they identify with. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, this is the term that is replacing what used to be called gender identity disorder. And yes, they've labelled it as a mental disorder. Now, we're focusing on gender and sexuality because it's an interesting space, but also because it's presently being fought over so viciously. An example of the interesting stuff that's happening is with the clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson that we're looking at this week. And you know that he came to fame because of his stance against shifting our use of pronouns to reflect people who have shifted their gender or who reject having a gender assigned to them, particularly a binary gender. He says no. He's not going to use those pronouns, and he's not going to acknowledge them. Not for him. When it comes to the social movements, there's also been some interesting stuff that's happened in regards to some of this, particularly with the women's movement. But it's a different thing that's interesting. We looked at race in those videos, critiquing Jordan Peterson's views on things. And here, I want to bring race in relation to sex. And here things get really interesting. It's an area known as intersectionality, where someone has more than one marginalized identity. Maybe they've got two marginalized identities, like being black and being a woman, or maybe one marginalized identity and one identity that associates them with the dominant group, for example, being black and male. Now, let's focus on female and the modern representation of the women's movement, the Me Too movement, because it's a really good example of the issues that sit in here. The modern day expression of the women's movement has been the Me Too movement. Originally, the phrase Me Too was a term used by black women to raise awareness of the prevalence of sexual violence against black women and girls. The movement was started in 2006 by Tarana Burke, a black activist who is working with black women and black girls who had been victims of sexual abuse. And it didn't attract any mainstream public attention until the term was used in 2017, over a decade later, by white Hollywood female movie stars. At that point, it came to prominence, most notably through the case against Harvey Weinstein. It was only when the sexual abuse of white women became part of the movement that it caught the attention of mainstream media and the public.
Now to the latest on Harvey Weinstein. The New York Times reporting allegations by numerous women who say the Hollywood mogul sexually harassed.
Also on that topic of race, woke is another really interesting term. The word woke was originally used to describe the process of becoming aware of police brutality towards black people in the US. People were waking up to the fact that this brutality against black people was happening. But now that word has been appropriated by old white conservatives who've weaponized it against both black people and other marginalized groups, and anyone who tries to support those groups, and anyone who argues for gender, sexuality, racial and religious equality, as well as equality for disabled people. And this use of woke to attack people who argue for such equality is often really fierce, particularly on social media. Now, here's a short clip of someone who asked a question of Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is an author, political commentator. He's a conservative thinker. He's associated with some right-wing thinking. And he's largely come to prominence through social media, alongside Jordan Peterson. And in fact, he's very supportive of Jordan Peterson. Here, he's challenging the idea that you can change your gender. There are lots of videos about this sort of stuff and this sort of genre. And typically there's a sort of genre video that shows one person intellectually beating up another person, trying to make someone else look really stupid. It's kind of portrayed as like a sort of intellectual cage fight, really combative. But actually, it's more about the fighting, less about being intellectual. Some of this stuff is not very intellectual at all when you start thinking about it. Anyway, let's just show you the video quickly.
As far as the actual psychological issues at play, it used to be called gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. Now they call it gender dysphoria. The idea that sex or gender are malleable is not true, that you are not the sex to which you claim to be. You're still a human being, and you're a human being with an issue that I wish you Godspeed in dealing with in whatever way you see fit. But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are. And if I call you a moose, are you suddenly a moose? Okay, if I redefine our terms. No, yes, that's right. Men and women are a completely different thing. This is true. Have you ever met a man or a woman? They're completely different.
It's a completely different thing. You can't just say you're a cat. It's not a thing. It's genders. It's not saying you're.
Okay, why is that? I don't understand. Why? Okay, let me ask you this. Okay, I won't ask you how old. I will ask you how old you are. Okay, because you're young enough that it's probably not insulting to ask you. So.
I'm 22, so I'm probably young and naive, right?
No. Why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60?
Because it.
And why can't you identify as 60? What is the problem with you identifying as 60?
It's not the same as gender. You can't just.
You're right. Age is significantly less important than gender. You can't magically change your gender. You can't magically change your sex. You can't magically change your age.
Two errors here. First, Ben uses a common form of argument which can be used as a really bad type of argument, known as the reductio ad absurdum. You can say it. Reductio ad absurdum. Fancy name. That's why I can't say it. This is where you say that if what a person says is true, that it leads to an absurd conclusion. So Ben says that if you tell me that I can change my gender, then that means I can also change my age. It's actually a really bad use of that form of argument, because it's not an absurd conclusion, because actually you can change your age. It's not magical, not a magical process, it's a cultural thing. There are traditional ways of calculating age used in such areas as East Asia, countries like China and Korea, where age is calculated based on a system of the movement of the stars and the moon. But also it's a system that accounts for the time that you spend in the womb before you're born. These are systems often known as lunar age. My lunar age makes me 2 years older than I am, as I am calculated by my calendar birthday type year calculation. And I'm not using my lunar age because it makes me older and I'm a bit ageist, which I shouldn't be. It's great being old. Apart from I'm supposed to be wise, and I seem to skip that bit. Anyway, most of those lunar systems, well, they've now been abandoned, and The more formal recording of age used by states is the system that we're all used to. But that lunar age system is still really commonly used by people in an informal way. They'll refer to their lunar age when they're with their friends and family, for example. So Ben comes across as a bit culturally blinkered on that point. He doesn't realise that actually the way we measure age is culturally determined. Not all cultures count age in the same way. But he's got a bigger problem, which is that categorical error that he's made in saying that women and men are biologically different, which means you can't magically change your gender. So he's confused because that thing about gender is not a biological concept. And whilst sex does appear to be a biological concept, it's not wholly biological because it's based on physical and physiological features such as chromosomes, hormone levels, and sexual anatomy that are actually shared between men and women. The sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are present in both men and women. The penis and the clitoris share a common ancestry, so to speak. Deciding to make a binary distinction rather than, say, consider male and female to be something other than opposites but maybe part of a continuum, the decision to go for the binary is a cultural decision. So even that statement that sex is purely a biological concept is not as true as you might imagine. So where the statement used to be seen as holding true, that sex was biological, gender was social, that started to break down. But some people resist that because it unsettles them. Okay, let's finish up there. And we'll pick up these issues from this week's videos in our tutorial if you're enrolled in the unit. And so if I don't see you there, I'll see you in the next video. So till then, ta-da.